I want to welcome everyone to the LSE's online platform. My name is Peter Trubowitz. I'm a professor in the International Relations Department and the director of the U.S. Center at the LSE, which is hosting today's event. Today is a special day for the U.S. Center and the alumni and friends of the LSE in the U.S., many of whom are in the audience. The U.S. Center launched 5 years ago this month, and we have benefited so much from the support of the school, the many faculty and students connected to the center, and LSE alumni who have helped us become one of the world's leading centers on the United States and its role in the world. I especially want to single out John Phelan, General Course Economics, a few years back. John and his wife, Amy, have played a key role in elevating debate and analysis about the United States at the LSE through their support of the U.S. Center, and especially through the Phelan Family Lecture Series, which allows us to bring events like today's to the LSE's many alumni and others around the world. And I know John is in the audience today. John, it is very good to have you with us, and many thanks again for your support. Today, we're also celebrating a major milestone, really, in the life of the school, the 50th anniversary of the alumni and friends of the LSE. And frankly, I can't think of a better way to mark the importance of the occasion than having the LSE's director, Minouche Shafik, on the platform with us today. Minouche, thanks so much for joining us. We're delighted you could be here with you. The platform is yours.
Thank you so much, Peter, and welcome to everyone to this event. It's a wonderful occasion to have this public lecture on the important topic of the future of democracy, which is part of the Phelan Family Lecture Series. And I wanted to add my thanks to John and to Amy. And it's particularly fitting, as Peter said, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Alumni and Friends of LSE in the United States. It was founded in 1970 as a philanthropic organization to actually help the school fund the library, the Lionel Robbins Library, and then went on to develop student residences at Butler's Wharf, and over the years has funded 149 LSE master's students from the United States. They also began a wonderful tradition of a bon voyage party in New York for American students on their way to LSE. And that great innovation has continued and become global in what we now call destination LSE events that are held all around the world for our incoming students. So I really wanted to thank the alumni and friends of LSE in the United States, and in particular, John Casey, who's the current president, Tom Kern, who's now the chair of the LSE Alumni Association, and the board of directors, the chapter members, the scholarship committee, and all the people in the alumni community in the United States who play such an important role in the life of the school and in supporting it. I just also wanted to say something as a prelude to this talk. For many Americans, and frankly for many students from other parts of the world too, but particularly for many Americans, coming to the LSE puts them in the most international community they have ever experienced. It gives them a global outlook that stays with them for the rest of their lives. I know in my case, I had come from Egypt, and I remember coming to do my master's at the LSE and being taught by my Italian classmates how to make a proper pasta. I landed in a study group of UK civil servants who became lifelong friends and future colleagues. And all of us can tell these sorts of stories at the LSE about how it opened our eyes to the rest of the world. And we suddenly realized that the way we did things in our families and in our countries wasn't the way everyone else did things. And that experience of living, studying, and working alongside people from other parts of the world fosters empathy, innovation, and cooperation. And today's talk is a fitting celebration of that tradition. In the last few years, we have seen how the open, liberal, rules-based order was so dependent on Americans and America, on the US being the guarantor of the system and providing leadership in times of crisis. The world's failure to define a collective response to the coronavirus pandemic has shown us how costly it is when we try and solve global problems from our national bunkers. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from John Ikenberry make the case for liberal internationalism. And I'm grateful to John Phelan and his family and to the Friends of the LSE in the United States for doing their part in keeping Americans and America engaged in the world. So over to you, Peter.
Minouche, that's terrific. That is looks like I am still on, I guess I'm not on mute. That is a terrific segue to the lecture for today. And I know that many people on the platform, we have a lot of IR students on the platform. They have eagerly been awaiting this event. So it gives me a lot of pleasure to introduce our speaker and discussant today, Professor John Ikenberry and Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri. We really could not be more fortunate to have this kind of a lineup. John Ikenberry is the Albert G. Milbank Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University, where he also serves as the co-director of Princeton's Center for International Security Studies. He's a very old friend of the LSEs. John has held prestigious appointments all around the world, including just up the road at Oxford's All Souls and Balliol College. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's the author of 8 books, some 14 edited volumes, and over 130 journal articles, essays, and book chapters. His newest book is just out with Yale University Press, and it's entitled The World Safe for Democracy, Liberal Internationalism, and the Crisis of the Global Order. And that's what he'll be drawing on in the presentation today. And dare I forget it, I think you can buy a copy of it. It's available, the link is available in the chat. If you're eager to pick up a copy. We're also very fortunate to have Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri with us today to help kick off what I am sure is going to be a very lively discussion. I mean, Leslie is the head of the US and Americas program and the dean of the Queen Elizabeth Academy for Leadership in International Affairs at Chatham House, which is literally just down the street from us in London. She's also an associate professor in international relations, and fittingly enough today, Leslie is an LSE alum herself, an international relations MSc graduate, no less. Dr. Vinjamuri has written extensively about international conflict, human rights, and social injustice. And for those of you who are early risers in London, she's a regular early morning presence on BBC, CNN, and Bloomberg, where she provides insight about America and its role in the world. A final few words before we get underway about the format. John will get us started with 20 or so minutes of comments. This is a big book that he is going to reduce to about 20 minutes. So he's going to hit the core themes and topics. And then Leslie will offer some comments on John's argument in the book to just kind of kick it off, get us started, and we'll open it up to all of you. And we've left a lot of time for questions. So please, please, please don't be shy. Send in your questions to us via the Q&A function on Zoom. I'll do my level best to get as many of them in as possible to John and to Leslie during the discussion period. So that's where we are. Now, normally, you know, at this point, if we were in the old theater, I would be asking all of you to put your hands together to give our speakers one of those warm LSE welcomes. That's not possible today. So in lieu of applause, I encourage all of you to pose questions in the Q&A period. John Ikenberry, welcome to LSE's online platform. It is really great to have you back at the school, even if only virtually. And I think everybody looks forward to hearing what you have to say. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Director Shafik, for your kind remarks and your introduction. It's an honor to be here for this 50th anniversary alumni event. and the Phelan family is, as you said, Peter, it should be recognized for the generosity and involvement in this, and it's just a terrific, exciting opportunity for your center and for this anniversary. The United States Center obviously has its hands full at this moment. I understand there's an election somewhere near where I live, and I'm sure your center is heavily involved in that. So Peter and the center are doing great things. I also want to thank LSE more generally, because I have been a kind of constant visitor over the years. And in last fall, in particular, Peter and Michael Cox, Professor Cox from the Ideas Center, co-hosted me for a book workshop to kind of shop this particular manuscript that I'm going to talk about today. So I want to thank them for that. And I also want to tell the audience that if you have problems with this book, please blame Peter and Mick Cox, because they are the ones who have their fingerprints all over the book. So my book begins really with today's crisis of the post-war liberal international order. And like many of you who are reading the events of the day and thinking about international politics, have a feeling that we're at a kind of world historical turning point, that the old order is giving way to something new. We can't quite see what it is. There's a kind of sense of breakdown or unraveling of the global order. And in some sense, this notion of the crisis of global order for me, and as I suggest, as I open the pages of my new book, a crisis that can be defined and manifest as a kind of sense of lost confidence in collective solutions to common problems. This loss of confidence in cooperation perhaps is seen most tragically, you might say, last spring when the G7 ministers got together virtually to talk about what has to be seen as the most gravest public health crisis the world has seen in 100 years, economic crisis as well. And the group couldn't even agree on a communique, sense that we can't move forward collectively. And this sense of dysfunction, of breakdown, is obviously for all of us worrying about international relations, leading us to ask very basic kind of world historical questions about international relations. For example, what are the sources of international order? What are the prospects for liberal democracy? Can capitalism and liberal democracy be reconciled? And so we, as scholars, are returning to the big questions and reading the classic books again: Morgenthau, Carr, Polanyi, the Keynes Hayek debate. Liberal thinkers were rediscovering Isaiah Berlin. So there's a sense of returning to the big issues. And for liberal internationalists, it's the question that has an echo of the 1930s. Is there a future for a liberal international way of looking at and organizing the world? Where can liberals and liberal internationalists plant their flag? And that is really the question that I take up in my book. And I engage that question in the first instance by taking the long view, by looking not just at the last few decades, but really over the last several centuries, going back to the beginning and tracing liberal internationalism from its origins over the last 250 years. And when we do that, we realize that liberal order and liberal internationalism did not begin in 1989, nor even in 1945, that it's a longer tradition. And that longer tradition is really a story as much of struggle as it is of triumph. During this 250-year period, as I suggest in my book, you find golden eras, of course, but also global catastrophes. The post-1989 era looks more like an anomaly, like a kind of unusual few decades in the context of this larger history. And indeed, over this longer run period, liberal democracy has been deeply contested, often a kind of close run thing. In the 1930s and early 40s, it had a kind of extinction moment. I was very moved and really inspired by a book in writing my own book, Ira Katznelson's Desolation and Enlightenment, which looks at liberals in the early 1940s, in 1945, as they tried to pick up the pieces, as they, as a generation, were trying to make sense of a whole cascade of crises and catastrophes, the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, the rise of totalitarianism, the rise of total war, the Holocaust, and oh yes, the atomic bomb. And it's a story, really an inspiring story of looking for ways to move forward, to reassess, to learn, and find toeholds where you can reform the system and dig back into a kind of liberal reconstruction period. So what I try to do in this book is do that, is to look back and reconstruct the long history of liberal internationalism, look for its lineages and genealogy, its ups and downs, how the liberal project has traveled a kind of crooked path of crisis and reinvention. And really three kinds of big kind of meta themes are what I've tried to bring out in this account. Number one, that there is a deep, resilient root structure on which liberal internationalism rests. There is a kind of historical and political gravitas to the liberal international tradition, with its Enlightenment roots and its rise in the age of democratic revolutions and traveling this 200 years. So a sense that there's something here that's formidable, that can sit alongside the other great traditions of thinking about the world: realism, Marxism, critical theory. And it's kind of hiding in plain sight. It's there, but reconstructing it and showing that it has a kind of connective tissue of ideas and projects. Secondly, to talk about its accomplishments and failures. Yes, its failures. We do now in the current period think of liberal internationalism, and immediately many young folks certainly think of the 2008 financial crisis or the Iraq War, in which liberal order seems to be complicitous. But we forget the other side, the way in which liberal ideas fed into this post-war reconstruction, the building of an order that allowed for the reintegration of Germany and Japan, the launch of the European project, the building of a framework in which liberal democracies could reform themselves from their laissez-faire 19th century origins to social democratic modern polities in Germany and France and Britain, the United States and Japan. Countries did it differently, but they all had a congenial platform for doing that and building that framework of institutions internationally. So there are accomplishments as well as failures we need to bring back. And then thirdly, to give a sense of liberal internationalism as a kind of world-weary pragmatic endeavor, that it's not simply a kind of triumphal march into the future where liberal democracy is going to take over, but rather a more pragmatic, opportunistic, reform-oriented endeavor to deal with problems that are generated by modernity. So let me just ask the question, well, what is liberal internationalism? And like Tacitus, speaking of the Roman era, when he said it was a period with rich varieties of rich in vicissitudes of its many different characteristics, so too that's true of liberal internationalism. The most simple formulation of liberal internationalism might be Wilson's famous phrase, a world safe for democracy, building a world safe for democracy. And in some sense that's true, but in some sense, but in a sense not conveyed in the popular interpretation of that word. It's understood and passed down to us as a phrase for expanding the liberal democratic world, moving liberal democracy outward, bringing the fruits of liberty to far off shores. Well, that's there, but the deeper meaning is really literally to make the world safe for existing democracies, for building a kind of ecosystem or environment in which liberal democracies can manage themselves. So that is the kind of portrait that I try to build in this book, a sense of liberal democracies managing their mutual vulnerability, creating a framework for liberal democracies to engage in what they always have to do and never will stop doing, which is manage the inherent contradictions or tensions, at least, in the liberal project: liberty and equality, individualism and community, sovereignty and interdependence. So creating a kind of zone for liberal democracies to survive and manage their affairs. A set of key convictions exist here in the liberal tradition. Four I would identify across these 200 years. One is trade and openness, from Richard Cobden to the WTO, a sense that trade and exchange is good, mutual gains are to be had, properly managed. Institutions facilitate cooperation. Democracies, thirdly, have a kind of like-minded ability to cooperate, special capacities and values that bring them together. They're unusual. They're open societies operating in an open international system. So they have a special intensity of needing to work together to create that ecosystem of cooperation. Then finally, economic and security interdependence is growing and has been growing across these centuries. And liberal democracies realize over and over again, rediscover at different historical junctures that, as you might say, boiling down liberal internationalism to its core, we can only be secure together. We cannot be secure alone. One way of thinking about liberal internationalism that I emphasize in the book is to contrast it with realism, its great rival. And here I would simply say that realism tends to talk about the problems of anarchy, a decentralized state system that creates security competition, balance of power, and sources of conflict between states. Liberal internationalism cares about the problems of anarchy, but in an important sense, its major framing can be seen as addressing what I'll call the problems of modernity, of the Industrial Revolution, of the science and technology forces that are shaping and reshaping the international system, creating this sense of interdependence. And in that sense, liberals across 2 centuries have had an ongoing conversation among themselves about the nature of modernity. Does it stack the deck in favor of liberal democracies or not? They've argued it both ways. But generally speaking, across these eras, there's a sense that liberal democracy is a kind of a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde phenomenon. It promises great advancements through innovation and science and learning, but also great dangers of civilizational catastrophe. And in that sense, liberal internationalism can be understood as a project for creating governance arrangements internationally for harvesting the benefits of modernity and guarding against its dangers. A few more kind of points or pointillistic kinds of observations about liberal internationalism before I talk at the end about the crisis and what we might do going forward. One of the things I've seen in working on this book is that liberal internationalism is really a bundle of internationalisms. It's not one thing, and it's really a coalition, a shifting coalition. And in the 19th century, this is very clear, and I spend a lot of time talking about the 19th century origins of internationalism, but it had these different threads that get woven together and then frayed and then rewoven together at different moments. Free trade was clearly one of the first internationalisms of this liberal era, but so too the jurists and the international law movement, the arbitration movement, the peace movement, which was very important, and people like Richard Cobden were both free traders and peace builders, if you will. The coalitions were forming along those different lines. The Congress movement. There were 1,000 international conferences across the Atlantic space between 1815 and the Second Hague Conference in 1907. The circuitry of internationalism was building during the 19th century. And you see then in the Wilson period a kind of bundling together, Wilson creating a kind of synthesis of internationalisms, making it a project, giving it a voice, putting it into the international system at Versailles. So internationalisms as bundled, and this framing of internationalism allows me to then observe that some of the crisis of liberal internationalism in the current period is the unraveling of some of these internationalism. Specifically, you might call it the neoliberal strand, which has its focus on integration of investment, trade, and at the international level, and the kind of social democratic internationalism, which kind of got unraveled and lost in that post-Cold War era. We'll come back to that. The other point I would make in trying to capture the essence of my argument is that I do see Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt as kind of archetypes of types of liberal internationalism. Wilson thought that liberal democracy was on the rise in his time, that there was a sense of civilization and modernization spreading liberal democracy outward. And in that sense, liberal democracy was the glue that Wilson wanted to use to tie the international order together, a kind of progressive modernity that could be brought out in a international system based on the League of Nations, international law and trade. The glue were the liberal democracies. In FDR's time, the notion of domestic and international order reversed. It was now the international order that had to be created and constructed in a more comprehensive way to provide the glue to keep the liberal democracies together. Much more a thinking about liberalism for troubled times in the 1930s and 40s, a kind of reinvention of liberal internationalism. Very important. I would argue that as we think about the future, we should look back to Franklin Roosevelt and this period when security and the way in which interdependence was shaping modern societies was given a kind of profound sense of importance, and putting that set of liberal international insights at the center of international order building. Now, to kind of move toward the last set of comments, Peter, I thought I would turn to what is in some sense the current debate. Why have things not worked out, if you will? Why are these troubled times for liberal internationalism? And in some ways, I start that conversation by observing that in some ways, our crisis is a crisis of success. That is to say, liberal internationalism that entered the world after 1945 was primarily a regional order, a kind of subsystem of a bipolar Cold War system. And it was not intended to be that way. FDR, after all, was hoping that there would be a kind of one world system with the Soviet Union at least partially inside of it. The Soviets were at Bretton Woods. But the Cold War really drove the world into two camps. And inside of the Western camp, liberal order was constructed. And it took on a club-like characteristic. You were either in or you were out. And if you were in, you had rights and responsibilities, but you also had obligations. And there was a kind of logic of conditionality. To be in was to get benefits like a mutual aid society, but to be in was also to buy into a suite of values and obligations. We called it the free world. And it was, in some sense, in this period that liberal internationalism experienced its greatest era. It promulgated social purposes that were above what a kind of Westphalian system would be able to provide. Liberal democracies found themselves a project and found a way to build an order that in many ways was the most successful ever created in world history, measured in terms of wealth creation, physical security, and the promise of social justice. After the Cold War ended, at that moment of triumph, in some ways, while everybody was cheering and the wall was brought down, the seeds of crisis were planted, in my argument, that in some sense, everybody got in on the game. And that was something you would expect if you're a liberal, and you'd celebrate if you were a liberal, because liberalism and liberal internationalism is about progressive inclusion of people and societies. Liberalism in America is a story, as Obama tells more eloquently than perhaps any American president, an imperfect union that has in that phrase a more perfect union, a sense that you're always trying to build on what the generations previously have done before us, a sense of expanding opportunity racially and in terms of the right to vote for women, the expansion of rights and protections. So this kind of evolutionary, each generation takes what they have been given and passes on the next generation of liberal order that builds on those achievements and goes further. So in that sense, yes, after 1989, the liberal vision was of a larger system, but something got lost in the shuffle. And the club character of this order, which supported these social purposes, broke down. And as I argue in the book, it's as if the club turned into a shopping mall, where like a shopping mall, you can walk in and take what you want, wander in, pick which institution or regime you want to join, ignore the others, a kind of buffet of choices. And this notion of conditionality, to be in was to get things, but also a kind of enforcement mechanism to make sure that there was compliance with those basic norms and rules. So what do we do today? These are my last remarks. Three quick comments. One is, I do think if we want to live in a world where liberal democracies have another golden era, where they are living together with shared social purposes about environmental sustainability, human rights, shared prosperity, a level of kind of performance of open societies. To get there again, we are going to have to rebuild the club, because without the club, those social purposes will dissolve in a larger global system defined simply by barren, realist Westphalian principles. So I do think liberal democracies have reason to find their way back into some kind of coalition. Doesn't have to be a Cold War style free world, but a coalition where they can drive the agenda of rebuilding international institutions. Secondly, I think that there needs to be a kind of reframing of the ideology, which I try to do across my 350 pages of book, which is to say, to reframe liberal internationalism as not as this kind of triumphant march to an ever more globalized world, but as a more pragmatic exercise of managing our mutual interdependence, economic and security. That globalization is not the goal. Managing our complex interdependent lives is. And that's different. That doesn't mean we measure success by is there more trade integration, but whether we have a kind of embedded liberal system where we have both the benefits of trade, we aren't headlong running into a mercantilist system, but we also sustain our social welfare ambitions. And then thirdly, I think we have to be willing to kind of play a kind of two-level game, to work for democratic cooperation, partly in the face of a rising China that is illiberal and doesn't wish the liberal international order with its social purposes as I've defined them well. It may want to live quite peacefully in a Westphalian system, but my argument is that we need to in some sense do both, to husband and attend the garden of the liberal democratic world while simultaneously look for ways through this more universal style principles of sovereign equality, look for opportunities to build common cause for global scale problems, climate change, proliferation of WMD, and so forth. In the final instance, I think liberal internationalism needs to, as I suggest in this book, go back to its basics, recover its its world weary essence. You can't be secure alone. You can only be secure together. And remember Ben Franklin's famous words to the representatives from the 13 colonies, his message on July 4th, 1776, we must hang together, gentlemen, and unfortunately they were mostly gentlemen. We must hang together, gentlemen, or surely we will hang separately. Thank you, Peter.
John, that's great. Thank you so much for that. That's a nice big kind of overview of the book. Leslie, it's great to have you on the platform. John has kind of given a big picture. What do you make of it? How should we be thinking about this? Why not get us started in the discussion here with a few comments?
Okay, I'm going to be quick because I looked in the Q&A and I think you already have 18 questions, which is not surprising given that this is the London School of Economics and it trains people very, very well to think and to think fast and to think hard. First of all, I want to say congratulations on the book, on a lifetime of work on liberalism, liberal internationalism, and I did actually want to read out what Mick Cox said because I thought it was one of the most elegant comments that I've heard, that I've seen in a book cover. And he says, John Ikenberry once more shows why he remains the most intelligent and most articulate defender of a world built over 2 centuries by Britain and the United States. He goes on, but it is quite a statement. And I also, I guess I want to congratulate you because what an extraordinarily difficult time to make the case for democracy and for liberal internationalism, and you stuck with it. Bravo! It's got to be one of the hardest challenges out there at the moment. Thank you to Peter for having me, to the LSE US Center, and of course to Minouche, who I'm a big fan of. So I just want to say a few things. First of all, the book is really worth reading because not just because it's John, but because it's very readable and there's a lot in there in addition to the argument that sort of is rich. And I think a lot of what we do increasingly in the academy is less rich, at least in international relations in the US. And this bucks the trend on every single dimension. So it's just worth reading the words. And one of the sections that I loved most was when you talk about the different conceptions of modernity. You talk about yourself as thinking about the ascendancy of liberal internationalism. But, you know, are we inexorably leading to more liberalism, more liberal values, liberal internationalism? Do we, secondly, no, or is the other vision that we have to actively bend the arc of the moral universe towards justice? That's where I am, just to put my cards on the table. It's pretty active and it's got to be fought for. And then I think the third one was multiple modernities, but get the book and read it because it's beautiful. The solution that John puts forward to, which is this kind of bringing together Woodrow Wilson and FDR of pragmatic experimentation, institutional innovation, that's FDR, and then Woodrow Wilson vision. I mean, I don't know how you do it, but it feels exactly like where we need to be. And frankly, and I'm not just saying this because I'm an alum, but I do actually think it's where the LSE is. So that's the space, and it's a beautiful book for putting it out. I have a couple of questions. One is, you know, I mean, my impulse and my instinct and my sort of value and belief is democracy, but why is it democracy for you? You know, so many people right now are bending over backwards not to talk about democracy. They're talking about inclusion. They're talking about open societies, your colleague Anne-Marie Slaughter. They're talking about Al Stepan, who I had tremendous regard for, the twin tolerations, right? Tolerance. There's so many ways in which people are trying not to talk about democracy. You stick with democracy. Can you just tell us a little bit about why that is, especially when, you know, the thin edge of democracy isn't delivering us what we want, the leaders that we need? Secondly, on fragmentation, you talk about, you know, things are fragmentation. In your remarks, I kept thinking, when you said, you know, people now, they think they can pick and choose. And I kept thinking, that's what wealth is about. That's what entitlement is about. In the book, you talk about fragmentation. And one of my reactions to that was, well, fragmentation sounds a lot less competitive than what it feels like we're moving into. right? Fragmentation feels like, there are a lot of offers out there. If you don't like the development assistance that Europe gives you, you can go to China, or you can go to any other number of powers. Malaysia's in the game of humanitarian assistance. I mean, there's lots on offer. That's fragmentation, but actually it's really competitive, right? And if the US and Europe are going to stay in this game, we know now they've got to invest in alternative infrastructure financing, in alternative 5G technologies, in any number of things, or the game is over. So is it fragmentation, and is fragmentation code for covering up a really much more competitive game? And then just quickly on your 3 points, sovereignty and intervention, clubs, and illiberalism. My question on sovereignty and intervention, you have a great line in there about human rights, and you say, sometimes the international community just has to take a stand on things. And I guess I want you to say more about, where do you draw the line? Because actually, as you know better than anybody, right? You've spent a lot of time in China. The rubber hits the road, and there are concrete trade-offs, right? Do you, when and if there's actually a moment to solve or move forward in a serious way climate change, do you call China out for the camps, for the Uyghurs, for genocide, as Biden has used the label of genocide, and risk that unraveling? So, what do you do when the rubber hits the road? I also noticed that you talked about Brazil, Turkey, and India not liking, hiding behind sovereignty and not liking the human rights discourse. You can add to the club the United States and the United Kingdom, as you know. Secondly, on your clubs, I'm kind of with you. We need a space for democracies to get together in an exclusive way and reinforce their values and talk about cooperation. Biden's talking about a summit of democracies. The UK government's talking about the D10. They're sort of, one and the same, it seems. But, what's the risk, and where do you draw the, how do you deal with the risk? You're schooled in international relations. Your friend is John Mearsheimer, your intellectual enemy, I guess. But encirclement, backlash, all the traps. So do you pay any heed to those arguments? Because it looks pretty risky right now. It looks pretty dangerous. And it seems like there's got to be something that really deals with that. And, what's the mechanism? Because it's not just fragmentation. It's presumably about constructing alternative orders too. So, if you're left out, you don't just pick and choose where you can get access. You just build your own other alternative order, question mark. And then I guess the final comment, sort of goes to that, which is, what do you do about illiberalism? And again, you said, you can accommodate, or you can be aggressive. And I wanted you there again, just to say a little bit more, especially as we head forward into this brave new world. We all hope that there's a change at some point in November without too many more lives lost. What is your big solution for the big challenge of the day, which is dealing with the illiberal geopolitical competitor?
So, John, before I let you respond to Leslie, I think what I'm going to do is, that's a terrific set of comments, Leslie, and I know that John is going to want to respond, but we've already got 31 questions. We've got hundreds of participants. I can see they're from all over the place. This is the power of the LSE platform. We've got folks from Colombia, from India, from Indonesia, and of course the UK and the US on this. And there are more coming in. I have my own set of questions having to do with the social contract that you raise and the club. But I want to give the first question to an IR student, Angela Chen, a University of Chicago student. That kind of gives it away. So the question is, to what extent does liberal internationalism contain the seeds of its own destruction? Clearly, she's been studying with Mearsheimer. By enriching its challengers, such as China, via the web of economic institutions, liberal internationalism also imposes cost on people within liberal democracies, lost jobs, increasing inequality, is the failure to protect the economic well-being of their own people a failure on the part of liberal states, or is it an inherent problem with liberal internationalism itself? And I must say that, not only did one of our students ask that question, but one of my colleagues, Mick Cox, posed the question also in the chat box by saying, you argue liberalism is the solution, but John Mearsheimer thinks it's the problem. How do you respond to that argument? There's two versions of the same argument, John. So maybe just to kind of get it started here in the discussion, how do you push back against the idea that liberal internationalism sows it's not a victim of its own success, it sows its own destruction?
Thank you, Leslie. And I have those questions, which I will either answer today, later, or offline. But and Peter, I guess I should take up the Angela Chen question, or the Mearsheimer Mick Cox question, which is a great one, and I've thought a lot about that. One of I do think there is a kind of seeds of own destruction and that aspect to it, and I think that's what I said, that it's a victim of its own success, that liberal internationalism became the only game in town because it was so bloody successful, and all the alternatives through the great contests of the 20th century fell away, whether it's those that were launched in Germany and Japan and then the Soviet Union. So in some sense, it became a kind of global platform when no others existed, and others wanted to join. It wasn't simply as the kind of the Mearsheimer position holds, that the U.S. saw, oh, now's our opportunity to sort of take the world and make it all in our own image, but rather there was a huge amount of demand for integration into this system. I spend a lot of time in South Korea. That's, in some sense, South Korea is a wonderful case of how a country that at one point was on the periphery of this order used it to make economic and political transitions to integrate into and rise up within. But where I see the kind of instabilities of the liberal project come from the fact that the liberal international project, perhaps even more so than realism, is a kind of thin, incomplete vision of the world. It's not like Marxism that has a kind of answer for everything and has a kind of sense of all the different features of the modern world are operating. You have a kind of theory for all the moving parts. Liberal internationalism has a smaller sort of agenda that has to work with other forces that are out there. So if you think about the great forces that liberal internationalism entangled itself with as it moved from the 19th to the 20th century, nationalism, capitalism, empire and imperialism, great power politics, and Anglo-American hegemony. All of those great forces were ones that the liberal international project, as I've defined it, had to, in some sense, accommodate with, appease, work with. So in some sense, liberal internationalism exists in a world where it has to have allies. It's a flag without an army. No one marches to liberal internationalism, and that's it. You have to tie yourself to other agendas, other movements, and that's true with some of these forces that have worked to undermine the current system. I'm thinking really of global capitalism that got way ahead of the governance system that was in place earlier to manage that system. So my answer is kind of yes and no, but it's not so much a failure of liberal internationalism. It's simply that there's a kind of paradox of liberal internationalism. It has these almost grand horizons of, intellectually speaking, universal vision, but it's a kind of shape-shifting project that builds itself on other social forces that it can never digest and put on a peaceful footing. So it's always on a kind of turbulent global system of of states, of markets, of social movements, of identities, of nationalism. It doesn't have a program for extinguishing those other forces. It has to work with them. So it's always juggling and adjusting and improvising and adapting. And that's the way I see the current crisis. And that gives me some sense of how we might move forward.
John, I'm gonna turn to the questions in a second, but I want to pick up on a theme in the book that you didn't talk so much about in the presentation, but you write passionately about it. I'm very sympathetic, as you know, to the argument that you advance, and I think we're very fortunate that that we have Minouche on the platform, because I know that she thinks about the issue that I'm going to raise in a second, and I know actually Leslie is writing to it as well. One of the things that you really talk about in the book is the need for a new domestic social contract or a bargain in Western democracies, not only the United States, but other democracies as well. And one of the interesting twists in the argument is that liberal internationalism requires an expansive and inclusive domestic social safety net if it's to succeed. So the problems are not only those that are outside, that it has to deal with, but also internally. And the social contract is badly frayed right now in Western democracies, including the United States. And so I suppose the question for you that I would like to hear, and I'm happy to open this up to Minouche and Leslie as well, is what gives you hope? Here we are in the middle of a pandemic. What gives you hope that that social contract, in fact, is going to be reconstituted? Because the problem can't be solved just from the outside. It's got to be solved from the inside as well. So some thoughts on that. It gives you an opportunity, I think, to talk about something in the book that I think plays a big role.
It is one of the 5 or 6 kind of big themes in the book. Modernity's one, and the kind of Wilson FDR archetype and many others. But you are correct that I observe in the book that when I look at 200 years of liberal internationalism, the greatest moments internationally for cooperation have been ones where that internationalism has been tied to progressive social movements, whether it's reform liberalism at the end of the 19th century or the progressive era that Teddy Roosevelt and Wilson lived through, and it had its counterpart in Britain and the continent and elsewhere. Obviously the New Deal, and then the Great Society period. Each of these moments of kind of rebuilding and extending the social contract was part of the international agenda, and internationalism was seen as legitimate and reconcilable with nationalism because it was seen as a kind of in common cause with progressive national ambitions of building a better society, more inclusive society. And think about what the liberal project is trying to do. It's almost dizzying. You're trying to sustain an open society at home, free press, freedom of all these different rights, religions, and so forth. And you're also trying to live in an open world. And that is, there are so many kind of inherent tensions in that balancing act. And one of the ways you reconcile it is having this kind of domestic society that facilitates shared prosperity and inclusion. And I think that is the missing piece. I do think internationally going forward, we are getting ready for an internationalist moment. I think liberal internationalism's time is almost here again, partly because of what I call the backlash to the backlash, that this kind of revolt against modernity that Trump and others represent is going nowhere. It's taking people and driving them ever nearer to the cliff. And so the kind of backlash to the backlash. But you're right, that can't simply be an international response. to share our vulnerabilities and plan together, work together. But it does require doing things at home, of making the international system work for everyday people who have everyday problems. And a Green New Deal, a kind of reweaving of the social contract. It's happened before, and it's repeatedly so. And the kind of moments of innovation and rebuilding of the coalition in favor of growth and shared prosperity has come precisely when things seem so dire, and things seem pretty dire. So it doesn't doesn't ensure that it will happen, but it does mean that it's a crooked pathway, and there are lots of opportunities. And those of us who wish the liberal project well should be, readying our talking points and extending our visions and rethinking old agendas, because I think our time will come again.
Minouche, I don't know whether you want to jump in. I know you're writing your own book on the frayed social contract, and I don't know, are we at the moment where John has just defined it as the backlash to the backlash? Is that where we are?
I mean, I do think that the US won't be ready to re-engage in liberal internationalism until it gets its own house in order a bit more. And in terms of the reasons Americans have this perception at the moment that international engagement is costly and not beneficial to America. And actually, I think it's been hugely beneficial. It's just the benefits have all accrued to a very small group. And having those benefits shared more fairly, I think would reignite a willingness to have a more, support a more liberal international order. Are we on the cusp of that? Gosh, I hope so. I mean, I think we're not quite, I think that cusp might take a few years. But I thought another thing you said, which was very interesting, is globalization is not the goal, it's managing our interdependencies for the common good. And what you see at the moment with COVID is people are trying to reduce the interdependencies. They're trying to reduce the interdependencies in terms of trade, in terms of labor flows, in terms of technology, and interdependencies in terms of the internet and that kind of thing. And I do think we're going to have to enter a period, if we are on the cusp, of recognizing that those interdependencies are beneficial again, and remaking the case for why trade is, creates benefits, and why mobility creates benefits, and why sharing information and technology creates benefits. And I think it will take a few years to make that case again.
Yeah, I think we have a liberal internationalist playing piano somewhere.
Oh, piano's being tuned.
So that's fine. It's kind of nice in the background. Leslie, before I turn to another question, do you want to say something here?
Yeah, let me just say something very quickly, which is two things. How do you make it work? And I guess when John says Green New Deal, I think, yeah, it is, as we know, it's about a growing role. State mandates, not market incentives. So are we going to see a shift towards a growing role for the state in making that inclusion and that inclusion as opposed to redistribution really work? My concern, the second reason why I guess I'm optimistic is not only because things are bottoming out, but also in the US, the unprecedented wave of social protests and social engagement. And even though the numbers are down now from where they were in June in terms of the percentage of Americans who are really behind that, they're still very high. My worry, and here I would value John's historical comparison because I don't have it. My worry is that so many people are doing so well, at least in the US. There are so many people that are just doing phenomenally well. The stock market is robust. I mean, Minouche knows a lot more about this, but my reading on it, I was in California recently, it was a wake-up call. And I just went, wow, we're sitting here in liberal London talking about inequality and poverty and destitution and death. And my God, are people wealthy, certain category of people. So if the bottom is dropped for so many, but actually for a lot of people, even through a pandemic, it hasn't bottomed out, I guess that's where I get very worried about whether there's going to be a moment to actually have the kind of transformation that John talks about.
So John, one of the things in the chat box that's going on here, where we got a lot of questions, but there are people saying they would like to hear some responses to Leslie's comments and questions. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up on one of Leslie's and tie it to a question that has come in as well. And that is, Leslie asked you to kind of say a bit more about the club and rebuilding the club. And I think one of the issues that that is coming up in the chat box too, that it might be worth having you say a bit more about rebuilding this club, which is basically the OECD and the major powers, major states in the OECD. I mean, to what extent does that work if China is not very much a part of that club? And there's questions that are coming in all different ways, shapes, and forms here in the chat box about China. And if China is outside, I guess the question here, to kind of amplify on Leslie's point, is does it pull states, even a South Korea, in two different directions, or not, in terms of kind of the idea of using, kind of going back to the club. This is kind of a return to the early Cold War period. So maybe you can say a little bit more about that and pick up the question about China and how China sits with respect to the club.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it does connect with Leslie's question about democracy as well, which I wanted to answer. I do think the book probably doesn't have as much about China as it should, or there could be another chapter that then sort of says, okay, now what about China? And I do reflect on it. And at the last paragraph of the book is really, in some sense, raising the question for today as a kind of echo of the question in FDR's era, when there was contemplation of a world where liberal democracies would be a kind of a shrinking minority in a larger illiberal world. And could the United States and its liberal democratic partners survive in such a world? And at the end of the book, I raised the question: is there a kind of critical portion of the world system that the liberal democracies need to hold sway over to preserve themselves? Or to put it the other way around, after a certain moment when the illiberal larger world grows larger relative to the democratic world, at what point does that have a kind of system effect and make it harder and harder for liberal democracies to remain liberal democracies? And I do think that China is a problem for the liberal order, and that one would not want to simply do what I think China might want, which is to kind of move to a new system where it's really Westphalian sovereignty and everything else is negotiable. And as I said earlier, that might be a peaceful world, a managed world, a one world system. It will certainly be one where you can, in that framework, tackle some of the most important problems, global warming, WMD, but you miss that kind of critical mass of democracies that are working in various ways to safeguard certain values they share, human rights, certain values I think that are embedded in their political economy, and certain values about liberal society and open society, free speech, that would get lost and would not have the kind of international framework to support in the China-centered world. So I do think we have to, walk and chew gum. We have to try to rebuild the liberal democratic world, because for me, if that liberal democratic world loses its critical mass and becomes a weaker, a kind of shrinking minority within this larger system dominated by illiberal states, then values I hold dear, and I think you do as well, are jeopardized. And that goes to Leslie's question about what's all the big deal about democracy? And in some ways, there is a kind of first move choice you have to make if you study international relations. Do you wake up in the morning and say the most important issues that we need to worry about are the problems of anarchy, whether we can manage great power competition and prevent an arms race and ensure deterrence here or something else there? Or do you think the first questions you need to ask in the morning are, how can I act today and how can we collectively act to safeguard values we care about? And I think they're Enlightenment values about speech and freedoms of information, transparency, accountability, civil society, and these more 20th century rights, FDR's four freedoms. From the preamble to the Declaration, to the Gettysburg Address, to the 14 points, the Atlantic Charter, to four freedoms, and into the current period, there are a set of liberal values that have been extraordinarily robust and are complicit in the wealth that Leslie says is out there, and the kind of comfort that many of us have, and the kind of ability to write books that we think we want to write rather than we worry about writing. And so I don't want to live in a kind of Orwellian world where I have to worry about whether I have basic freedoms. And so we should safeguard those. There's nobody who is out there who can rob them if we act in the way that we can act. We don't have to invent a new theory of the universe. The problems we have, the solutions to the problems we have, we kind of know them. Whether it's environment, whether it's reform of the social contract, it's kind of the politics isn't there yet.
But John, I've got a bunch of questions that have one way or another have to do with the election and the implications of a new administration. And I must say, I think Grant Gilbert, who is an LSE alum, IR, MSc 2000, gets the award for stating it so succinctly. So what's the first piece of pragmatic advice you'd give to a new US administration to strengthen the liberal international order? And we can push this afterwards, but you've got full reign here. You have, okay, let's just put it this way. You have Joe Biden's ear and he's elected. What's the pragmatic piece of advice?
First of all, I would wear a mask. And a big one. It's Trump. I don't know what that was all about, but comparing mask size. I guess what I would probably do, or what my suggestion to President Biden is a suggestion I made in an article in Foreign Affairs this past summer, which is not an original idea, but it is a kind of a gathering of the Estates General, so to speak, as you think of the French case, or the gathering of the partners of the countries that are kind of you want to strengthen alignment with, to reaffirm ideology of security cooperation among the democracies, the alliances themselves, extended deterrence, cooperative security as an important value that liberal democracies share across the different regions of the world. So I think a kind of, the first thing that the U.S. is going to have to do is rehabilitate itself. Who's going to trust the United States for the next cycle of history? We're so polarized that we could have 4 years of this, but then it could go the other way. So who wants to invest in a leader that looks so uncertain? So you need to kind of as we learn in international relations, make credible commitments, things that cannot simply be undone overnight, to redeploy, to join. The first announcement should be, we are going to rejoin the Paris Agreement. There should be a raft of on the first day kinds of announcements. But I think at the kind of process level of kind of signaling a kind of ideological reorientation of America back to a kind of cooperative, democratic-centered internationalism, this kind of gathering of the partners.
Gathering of the partners, right? Okay, so that kind of a return to the kind of core allies and trying to repair and rebuild the relations there.
Symbolic steps,
right?
That kind of signal what's to come.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that people, this actually goes back to a point that Minouche raised earlier, that people need to realize, you know, if it is a Biden administration, the country it's going to continue to be deeply polarized. That's not going to go away.
It's not going to go away.
And he's going to inherit a pandemic with millions of people out of work. It's not, look at the debates have nothing to do with foreign policy in any direct sense. People are focused domestically. So he is going to have to be the next president. I mean, this would be true if it's Trump, although he's already kind of predisposed that way. He's going to have to be very, very strategic about where the political capital is invested internationally, it seems to me. That's just echoing your point, I think.
I agree with that. And I think that you would hope that some of America's partners will do things that will register domestically in the United States. As, you know, we're now returning to a leadership role and see what it brings us as a society. In other words, you need kind of performance legitimacy for re-engaging, and so ways to have wins and to show that this is something that brings benefits back to everyday Americans. So I agree with you. It's a very tough period, and you know, you only have one FDR every 100 years, so it's hard to imagine fireside talks and rebuilding coalitions. But I think just to be focused on the United States for a moment, I think people are just weary of this incessant craziness. And it's not just those who are in blue states. I think there's a weariness to this and kind of need for kind of competence and a kind of calm resolution focused on problem solving and governance. I think there's a real demand for that. And so I think there's going to be an opportunity here.
Let me pick up another thread that runs through a number of these questions. We've got like 44 questions on here. I mean, so it's great just kind of like flipping through them. They're terrific. And I do want to welcome the people who have joined us from Hong Kong and Iraq and Spain. It's good to have you on the platform as well. There's a line of questioning that focuses on international institutions, and I think reflects a disappointment with them, and that they have, in a sense, failed us. I mean, and one in particular has focused on the WTO, and another one on the WHO, and a sense that the problem isn't only inside the United States, or it's not only the Brexit crowd in the UK, but that there's a problem at the level of global governance, that those institutions are not, I think I take the point here, they're either not representative enough of the distribution of power in the international system. That seems to be one line of argument. But another line of argument, if I'm interpreting it correctly, is that they're not democratic enough. And so that they're not reflecting the voices of people in the club itself. So some thoughts about that. And
Yeah,
if you had a magic wand, or you could change it, how would you change it?
yes, that's a great question, and there are lots of things to say about that, but I'll try to be brief. One of the things that I've argued is in the book a little bit, but it's in this foreign affairs article, called The Next Liberal Order. I do try to suggest that this so-called D10, the high capacity democracies, who might be a coalition that would be built or rebuilt in the next administration, next period, would be driving reform of these institutions, starting with a rethink of the global trade regime. And I think the questioners are absolutely right. There's a kind of sense of breakdown and failure and disappointment across the boards. But you kind of have to get in there and work with them. There probably were mistakes along the way with the WTO, and there may have been a mistake at the very beginning with how one negotiated the entry of China, the importance of conditionality and status and so forth. But we are clearly going to need things like principles of dispute resolution, most favored nation, non-discrimination, the kind of norms that the liberal institutions have embedded in them at a kind of deep level, bring them out to help inform this kind of next generation of in this case, trade regime, or in the WTO, rethinking how to prepare the WTO for the next pandemic. What we don't want to be doing is pulling back, as the Trump administration is doing, and saying we don't want anything to do with them. And then China is in some sense burrowing into the institutions. Some of this is very good, but some of it is not so good. Some of it is a contest over values, of stripping out human rights values, democracy values that we might want to negotiate their continuing place within those institutions. So one of the possibilities is that there could be a kind of constructive competition between China and this D10, or the US and its allies, on rebuilding and reforming international institutions. It doesn't have to be destructive competition. It can be, we are both trying to invest in the next generation of international institutions and rules, and we would like to see them be friendly for liberal democracy and to be functional for the kinds of political systems that we have. And so that's a kind of battlefield, you might say, that is there, that could bring us back into the reform agenda in a way that could help us address those disappointments that I think we all feel.
I'm tempted to kind of stay on this for a second, because there's a very kind of interesting set of questions that's come through as well, and maybe Minouche will want to jump in on this as well. On the international organizations, Brandon Fitzgerald, who is an MSc-IR student at UCL, we do allow questions from UCL, asks, can you speak to how liberal international organizations could better manage developmental inequities among core and semi-periphery and periphery nations? So part of the problem here is that if you try to deal with this as a club issue, you run the risk of, perhaps, I think the concern here is exacerbating asymmetries that exist between advanced and less developed nations, kind of, center versus semi-periphery or periphery. So some thoughts about that, John, and Minouche, if you want to come in, or Leslie. Yeah.
Let me let my two panel partners go first if they want to.
I think I'll go back to something that Leslie said. I think the international development architecture has become fragmented. And just like with the political architecture. And I think in some ways for developing countries, it means they have many, many more choices in terms of financing opportunities. So if you want to build a railway or a water system, you can go to the Chinese, you can go to Japanese Exim Bank, you can go to the World Bank. And so in that sense, developing countries do have more choices. But I think where the current structure fails is not so much in responding to national development needs, but its failure to be able to deliver global public goods. And, climate, trade, et cetera, rules of the game around the WTO, for example. And so for developing countries, I think the current structure, the current structure serves them okay at the national level, but I think fails all of us at the global level.
Good. Maybe we can, unless John, you want to jump in, or Leslie, I can move to the next question. There's also another thread. I've gotten a lot of questions on Russia. And where does Russia fit in all of this? Let me see if I can find, there's one from Alina Galimova, an LSE alumna. What do you think the role of Russia is in building a world safe for democracy? Is there a role for Russia?
Well, I guess, there's a role, but does Russia want to play that role? There was Gorbachev defined a role for Russia, and then kind of his successors retreated. The West probably didn't array the choices and behave in the way that made it more likely, and probably made less likely, that they would step into a role as a supporter, using involvement in the international order to build a coalition domestically to tackle problems of corruption and oligarchy. In some sense, there is a kind of inherent contradiction between the current regime structure and power structure in Russia and being a full member of a liberal international order, given what that order entails. So if Russia were to play, so I'll just make two quick points. One, if Russia were to play a role, it would be in a kind of successor regime that would be wanting to, as many countries have over the decades, use involvement to strengthen the hand of reform groups, reform elites in their country who want to redistribute wealth, overcome corruption, reorganize the resource extraction sector, and bring people back into the coalition. So at some point, the liberal international order, if it's active, up and running, healthy, legitimate, if these liberal democracies can get themselves back on their feet, that creates a kind of club or an order out there that Russia, at least the reform elements in Russia, the liberal internationalists, and indeed there were such things around Gorbachev at one point, I've written about that, to make their way into the order. I think there is probably, I've also written about the kind of higher liberalism that at some moments the liberal democracies need to think in complex ways about what they do and how it has impacts in illiberal states. And it's not always pushing democracy until they say, okay. It's often restraint that creates space for coalitions inside of those states that have to do it on their own, because we can't impose our vision on them. So it's that kind of complex
Right.
or longer term strategy of trying to find a future role for Russia. Right now, it looks pretty toxic to me.
Okay, thanks for that. So look, we're at 5:27, which means it's the bewitching hour, and it's time to wind things down. I'm actually going to give John the last bite at the apple here. And, I was tempted earlier on to ask the question, what keeps you awake at night, when you think about the liberal order? But I actually want to just give you an opportunity. What gives you the most hope when you look out, at today and scanning, whether it's the US or scanning kind of the international horizon, for our many students that are on the platform today? Where's the promise? Where's the hope? What is it that just kind of really, when you wake up in the morning, you think, you know what, it's there, it's working, it's the potential is there.
I guess I would say that what makes me optimistic, if that's the word for it, is that we've been here before, that we've seen a long struggle unfold over really decades and centuries within liberal societies, and it's kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's, as I said earlier in my remarks about, the both inside of societies and among these liberal states, there's a kind of ongoing agenda that is passed on from generation to generation. The fact that we've kind of dusted ourselves off and got up from earlier moments when things have been down. I love this Obama quote from his eulogy for John Lewis in July of this summer, where he said, "Now this country is a constant work in progress. We were born with instructions to form a more perfect union." Explicit in these words is the idea we are imperfect, that what gives each generation purpose is to take up the unfinished work of the last and carry it further than anyone might have thought possible. So I think it's that kind of ratcheting of the liberal project that you continually work to find opportunities. When at Princeton, we took Woodrow Wilson's name off my building, and Wilson was a very complex figure. He pushed the arc of history in certain ways, but he kind of tamped down or prevented that arc to bend in other ways, particularly on race. But we continued on, and the day before Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated, there was a women's suffrage movement in Washington, D.C., and the white women's suffrage activists would not let the black women march with them. They were forced to march at the end of the parade. So even our most prized progressive movement to give women the right to vote was itself tangled up with legacies of race. And yet now all of that is in the background, and we have a larger and more inclusive society, and we have standards that have never really been realized, but that keep us on track for making even an imperfect international order a site for struggle to make it more closely resemble its founding ideals. And so that's what gives me optimism. Thank you, Peter.
That is a great place to leave it. And it really captures, I think, the sensibility of the whole book. And it is, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a great opportunity to listen to John Ikenberry and Leslie Vinjamuri. It's been a special treat to have Minouche Shafik on here with us. Plenty of food for thought. John and Leslie, on behalf of Minouche and the LSE, I want to thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts with us. To everybody out there, thanks for joining us. Stay healthy, stay safe, take care, and we'll see you next time.